Here we go. We are already on Sacred Seasons session 4. This is the third one because we did an introduction. But today we're talking about winter solstice festivals, which is appropriate because the winter solstice is coming around in just a few days.
Yeah,
So, as we have typically done, we can define some words. We know what a solstice is in terms of um, me, is it meteorology? I don't even know what category that would fall under. I
yeah, I
don't
don't either.
whatever the category would be for that. But what is winter? I think is an interesting question to consider. We, kind of assume these things, but like with our fall harvest um, conversation, we have to remember that the experience of winter is not a universal experience. People in the tropics, for example, do not experience winter. And of course, people in the southern hemisphere do not experience winter at the same time as people in the northern hemisphere. So that is something that is important for us to keep in mind as we are considering this particular topic. Um, when I think of winter, I think of the weather and agriculture. Everything's cold, everything is quote unquote dead or dormant, hibernating, waiting. Um, there are um, things to things to be said for winter in terms of the weather. Formally, um, meteorology. Um, there, of course, are places in the world where it gets very cold, and so they study and come up with more specific terminologies. And so I learned a little bit about the Swedish Meteorological Institute, and they have a term called thermal winter. And the definition of thermal winter is when the daily mean temperature is below 0 degrees Celsius for 5 consecutive days. So it is freezing for 5 consecutive days. That means that in Redding, California, we never have winter. But of course, in our opinion, we do have winter because it's certainly not the same as July. So I think in some ways winter is relative. Right? Winter is contextual, how people define and interpret and understand what winter is depends on where you live. People in Scandinavia, of course, get a lot more cold weather than we would here because of the pressure systems of the Atlantic versus the Pacific. Um, they get lots of high pressure systems that come through and create incredibly cold temperatures as we were discussing today, Cindy and I, when it is sunny, that is when you get the coldest temperatures in the wintertime because there aren't any clouds or moisture in the air to hold in the heat, and the very little heat that you get from the sun. And so you're when you have high pressure systems, you are more likely to have much colder weather. Um, and so, for example, the coldest January on record in Stockholm was in 1987, and it was also the sunniest January on record. So that makes sense when you understand how cold weather works. People who don't come from cold weather places are surprised when they hear that can sometimes equal cold if the humidity is also low. Um, in terms of astronomy, that's probably the category I was looking for earlier about the solstice. In terms of astronomy, um, the winter solstice is the day of the year that has the fewest hours of light due to the um, the tilted axis of the Earth, and the slow change as the Earth revolves around the sun and rotates around its axis. But because of um, the lag that occurs when the sun's rays are, the sun's rays are absorbed by the atmosphere and by the ground, and so it actually takes a little bit longer for, what we would consider to be truly winter to set in um, than um, than it otherwise would. And so we should consider the winter solstice to be the center of the winter season. It should be the middle of that 3 month period. But because of that seasonal lag, it takes a while for it to actually get cold. And so we typically understand winter to be from the time of the solstice or even maybe a few weeks after, to be when it's truly the coldest period of the year. Um, Depending on the culture, you get different understandings of when we transition from fall into winter. Um, and then, of course, we have the difference with the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere. So some cultures would say that um, winter begins on on the solstice and ends at the equinox, and then that's when spring comes, which I think is, pretty much what we do. Um, we don't understand that we are fully in the quote season of winter until we pass that solstice. But then other cultures think about it a little bit differently. They think about it in terms of kind of the mid period between the equinox and the solstice as the beginning of the next season, and then the solstice represents the center of the season, and then the middle between the solstice and the spring equinox is kind of the end of that period. Um, Historically, there's actually some interesting ideas that we get from different places. In Europe, there was a time when Martinmas, the St. Martin's Day, was considered the first day of winter in their culture, and Martinmas is actually celebrated on November 11th. And this was one of those the day that fell kind of between the equinox and the solstice. And then similarly, Valentine's Day, then St. Valentine's Day was perhaps considered to be the end of winter and the beginning of spring, even though, of course, not everywhere do you get spring flowers in February. Where I grew up, you didn't get them in March, let alone February. But different places have different experiences and therefore different understandings of how this works. We've got, the relationship of animals to winter is really interesting. We've got, some animals that will leave to get away from the cold temperatures and the lack of access to food under the snow and things like that. This is, of course, more common with flying animals, birds, and even we've got some butterflies that famously migrate seasonally. And then, of course, we've also got hibernation, the quote unquote sleeping through the winter, which is something that I always wished that humans could do when I was growing up in the cold and dreary northeast of the country. And there are different exact um, biologies of how all of that works, depending on the species of animal, whether they're a mammal or a reptile, things like that. But we've got, everything um, from gophers to snakes to bats all experience some kind of hibernation experience. And then, of course, we've got animals that just suck it up and deal with it. They store food and live on that until the spring comes, and that would be, our friends the squirrels and the raccoons, the beavers. Some some guys like that won't sleep through the winter. They'll just store up and be able to live on that, which unfortunately is what we humans have had to do over the course of time and suffer through, not just sleep it off and get it over with. Um, Winter also has, like we've talked about already, humans look for meaning. They look for patterns, and then they want to know not just how something works, but why it works, and that helps them to feel a sense of control over their environment, and therefore a sense of security, safety, and then therefore the ability to survive. And so it's not surprising that different cultures give meaning to these experiences of colder weather, and particularly in times when it's more dangerous to live because you don't know necessarily where your food's going to come from or whether you stored enough up, things like that. And so, just a couple of examples there in Persian culture, and we're going to talk about this holiday a little bit later, more in full. But in Persian culture, there is a myth um, in that is connected to the winter solstice, which is called Yalda, and that means birth. And it's something that's been celebrated in Persian culture, Iran, for the most part now, for thousands and thousands of years. And it is the birth of Mithra, which is the goddess of light, goodness, strength, things like that. The earth, the power of the earth, kind of images. So the winter solstice is the time when light is born, which I think makes sense because the next day after that day, we start getting longer days and moving toward, summer and warmth and things like that. And then, of course, I think most of us are familiar, at least a little bit, with the Greek myth of Persephone and Demeter. Demeter being the goddess of the earth, and Persephone was her daughter and was beautiful. And Hades, who was the god of the underworld, fell in love with her, wanted to marry her. No one would allow him to, so he kidnapped her to be his wife. Zeus, the head god, ordered Hades to return her to her mother, but Hades tricked Persephone into staying in the underworld. In most cases, she was tricked into eating the food that the dead eat, and so she had to stay there, at least partially, because that was part of the deal. If you ate, then you had to stay. So Zeus had to kind of make a deal where Persephone could spend 6 months out of the year with her mother on the land, on the top of things, on the earth, and then 6 months she had to spend with Hades. And so the understanding being that because Persephone was being kept from Demeter, the goddess of the earth, for those 6 months, Demeter became depressed, and that is why we have winter. So it's, that explanation of why is it this way? Why does this happen? So to say, well, because Demeter is depressed because she doesn't have her daughter with her, and so she's sad, and we don't have the plenty that we're used to coming out of the earth during this time of year because she's going through that. And in a lot of ways, I think that feels worse than I don't know because, all these gods are running around doing what they're going to do and affecting our lives and affecting our ability to survive. But certainly when you live in a world where you don't understand things about how the earth works and tilts and axes and all these things, I guess it's better than nothing. I don't know. I suppose we can never really say because we've not ever lived in that kind of world. So, any other thoughts or questions that come up to you when you think about the the concept of winter?
That's right. Um, when we first moved to Reading, which was, you know, 60 years ago. Um, the people always used to say that winter wasn't over, that you couldn't take down your heater until May 1st,
Huh.
and you couldn't go outside barefoot until May 1st
Interesting.
because it was still winter.
Wow.
Uh-huh. And I remember that because it seemed so strange, to think about it. But people didn't have a heater up all year round. They would
Hmm.
put it up and then take it down, and that was when. And you didn't do it before then, or else you were really in trouble.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but
In
I
New
don't think
Jersey, oh, go ahead.
I don't think summer starts May 1st.
No, it does not. But maybe that's when they feel confident that it's not going to be cold enough anymore to need a heater. In New Jersey, there was always, I only lived there for 4 years, so I don't know if this was the case all the time or even if it still is the case, but every year while I was there, it seemed like there was a false spring in the last week or so of February. There was always a false spring, and it would be so warm and beautiful, and people would get out their t-shirts, and of course, these are middle, young, early and mid 20s guys, so they're all getting out their shorts and running around and playing frisbee on the quad and things. And then the next week we would have a blizzard and it would be back to winter again. And I felt like that happened every year. And then even when I went back to Pennsylvania, that happened. I remember there was one year when um, after Penny and Teddy had been born, there was a February where it was so nice that we got out our picnic blanket and went outside and had a picnic dinner. They loved doing that. And then the following week we had a big blizzard, and then we had videos of them sledding down the hill with their bundled up in their snowsuits. So there's certainly something there that we want winter to be over as quickly as possible, and we get tricked into thinking that this might be it, even though we know that it's not really time yet. Um,
But
but
that happens here too.
yeah,
It's like in the end of January, February, um, and all the trees bud out, especially the fruit trees, and then they freeze.
yeah, yeah, and then you have to worry that are they going to come back again or not?
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's think a little bit about some more of that meaning related to winter. I put some pictures here that are associated with winter, but what are your thoughts when you think about winter? What do you think of?
I think white, which is strange because we don't have white here, but that always makes me think, the cold. I equate the white to cold.
Bing Crosby's gotten to you, huh?
I think so. He is a Gonzaga grad.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't think he actually graduated. I think he was kicked out his senior year, but
That sounds about right.
but there is a statue on campus.
You have any thoughts, Karen?
No, I'm just going to say I worked with his sister-in-law, so they had a ranch up here, so
Well,
that's
then
probably why.
then I guess we have to just, because everybody's connected to him, he gets to dictate what winter is, huh?
Yep. And I was hired to take her job when she left the Intermountain area.
Okay.
Karen, so there you go, a small world. And I
Yeah.
spent the whole year being told how she did things.
Mm.
Well,
Well,
these images, Katie,
yeah.
they don't look like winter to me.
No? Well, I'll explain these to you.
Okay.
So the one on the left there with the guy with the cape and nothing else on, that is a painting from 1683 called Allegory of Winter, and it was painted and hung in the palace in Warsaw, Poland. And so this is a depiction of winter. And this is actually a story from the Odyssey, um, where um, we've got in the center there the king Aeolus. He's um, he's the king of the island of Aeolia, and he lived with his wife and six sons and six daughters. And Odysseus ended up on this island when he was traveling um, in after the war, and in order to make sure that Odysseus could make it home, Aeolus gave Odysseus a bag that contained all of the winds of the world except for the gentle west wind. And so, in that way, Odysseus was able to contain all of the winds except for the one that he needed to take him home, which gently took him home. But when they were almost there, Odysseus's men found the bag, thought it had treasure in it, opened it, and all the winds came out, and they drove them back to Aeolia. And because of this rotten luck, Aeolus thought that Odysseus probably was hated by the gods, and so he wouldn't help him anymore. He refused to participate in it anymore, and so they were kind of stuck, and they had to figure out how to get home on their own. And of course, we know that it took him quite some time and many adventures and many false almost theirs in addition to this one before he finally made it home. So that's the story that um, somehow has to do with winter in the mind of the painter of this image. And I'm not even going to try to say his name because it's Polish, and we all know how that goes. Um, First name Jersey, I can get that one, Jerzy, but the rest definitely not. Then we've got the black and white one there in the center is a cartoon that depicts Jack Frost. He is being depicted as a general in the or the American Civil War, because that was the time of year that or time that this image was sketched. And of course, Jack Frost being the character that is the personification of winter, of frost, of snow, of ice, of freezing cold. He is a variant of another character, Old Man Winter, who is depicted there as the other black and white sketch. And he is um, held responsible for the cold weather, for the nipping of fingers and toes in cold weather. He's also given responsibility for the change of the colors and the trees in autumn, bringing on um, bringing on the cold weather that causes that. And then also when you get cold windows that freeze with the icy patterns that kind of look like fern leaves on windows, he is given credit for that art as well. Um, in um, in the late 19th century, so after this sketch of Jack Frost as a Civil War general, um, Jack Frost became more of a fairy kind of character, mischief maker, sometimes a hero, but usually some of a kind of a Loki like character causing mischief and mayhem, using his powers with the ice and snow. And then those types of personifications and images rolled then into the 20th century, and then we ended up with there were a couple of Rankin Bass Jack Frost stories that had some of that mischief making involved as well. And then at the bottom there, I just pulled one that had, snow and dead empty trees and things like that. But then I also pulled the picture of Stonehenge with the sun coming directly in the right spot there to shine through the stone. I don't know how do you describe that, the arrangement of the stones. And so because that is the case, the understanding is that somehow the ancients were, attuned to this and they cared very much about it. It makes a lot of sense as we've talked about, that it's so important for humans to understand and control their environment so that they can survive. And certainly, that ancient fear of the unknown, of the darkness, of what's out there that might get me, certainly makes it um, more likely that you would fear the day that you have the shortest amount of daylight and the longest amount of night. And so to have a healthy respect for that and to celebrate the end of the decline and the beginning of the renewal is certainly to be expected, I think, historically and even biologically. So comments on any of these things that stick out to you, know that you know what they are. All right. Then let's hop into some specific celebrations. So we're actually going to start with um, some historical celebrations with Saturnalia and Sol Invictus. Saturnalia is still celebrated in some places. I think it would be unfair to say that everywhere Saturnalia is, if it's still celebrated, is only celebrated in kind of an ironic way. I think there are some people who legitimately want to participate, in the historical festivities and the traditions of Saturnalia. But obviously, it's not the same, not exactly the same as it was before, when it was kind of the major festival during that period of the year. So Saturnalia, these are actually two different Roman um, holidays, festivals that ended up kind of meshing into one another over the course of time. So Saturnalia is the older of the two festivals. It is, of course, a holiday that honors the god Saturn, um, and it was held in the Julian calendar, beginning on the 17th of December. Um, Originally, it was just one day, and then over the course of time, it expanded with more festivities, so that then it became a 3-day festival, and then later it turned into a 7-day festival, so that it extended from the 17th of December until the 23rd of December. Um, there was a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn, of course. There were public banquets. There was gift giving, lots of partying, a carnival kind of atmosphere, an overturning of Roman social norms. So, for example, gambling, which was normally outlawed, was permitted. There's an image there down in the lower left corner of masters are actually serving their slaves food, and there's gambling going on at the table. Um, you can see the people that are kind of having a good time carrying their probably drunk friend around. It seemed like it was a time of liberty for everyone to behave in ways that they normally would not be allowed to behave, both slaves and free people um, in common. There was often an election of the quote king of the Saturnalia, and that person was able to give orders, and they presided over the partying that went on. There were lots of gift exchanges using gag gifts. Often gifts that were given were small figurines that people would make out of wax or pottery and paint, to give to their friends or to their enemies to make jolly together. Um, but Saturnalia also has had a bit of a dark side to it, which makes sense because Saturn himself as a deity has some darkness to him as well. There is, the joyful side, the carelessness, because you are experiencing, bounty and well-being, but there's also a bit of a threat. There's an underlying danger to Saturn, um, in in the depiction, in the personification of that god. And so, in, for example, the third century AD and later, there are recordings of um, gladiatorial games that were given during the month of December, and the people, the gladiators who were part of the games would battle to the death. And the understanding was that the um, dead gladiators were actually offerings to Saturn during this time, because there was an understanding that Saturn needed to be placated because of his connection to the wife of Saturn was actually a goddess of the underworld, and so Saturn was connected to death and to destruction and things like that. And so the idea that the these gladiators kind of fulfilled that sacrificial requirement, and it was in particular the human heads that were important to Saturn. So Saturn demanded human heads, but eventually there developed a new tradition where instead of actual heads, the Romans offered masks or effigies or tokens that had heads on them, and they were enough to to take care of everything that was required of them. And another thing that kind of fit into this category is, because the Greek word phota could be translated both as light and as man. There was an understanding that you could give the gift of candles. The light of life, so to speak, can be offered as a substitute to Saturn, and lit so that they can, kind of take the place of the human sacrifice that had been done in centuries before. So those are just a few tidbits about Saturnalia. Obviously, it was a whole, major thing where lots of things were different, and society pretty much shut down for several days, even a week at a time, in certain places. But there was also this other holiday that, although a different holiday, and it ended up kind of being connected to Saturnalia. And the other holiday is called Sol Invictus, which is Latin for invincible sun or unconquerable sun. And Dies Natalis is the day of the birth. So the day of the birth of the invincible sun. And Sol, or Sol Invictus, was the official sun god of the late Roman Empire. And so as time went on, Saturnalia, even though it continued to be celebrated, Saturn was not necessarily considered a major god anymore. And instead, it was this Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. Um, in the year 274, this was when Sol Invictus was kind of established. This was the Emperor Aurelian. He revived the cult of Sol, the old Latin god, and made Sol Invictus the main god for the empire. And so from then on, Sol Invictus often appeared on the currency of the empire, and often would be wearing a crown made out of the sun, and often perhaps driving a chariot through the sky, things like that, to indicate that that he is in charge and powerful and strong and all of that. So this idea with Sol Invictus was not just because Aurelian and then the emperors that followed, not just because they liked this god, but because they could kind of glom on to the power that this god had and use that to maintain their control over the empire. So this coin that I have here is actually a depiction of the Emperor Constantine with Sol, with the god Sol Invictus represented behind. So Constantine is there in the front with his laurel type of thing on his head, and then behind him is the god Sol, with you can see the crown of the sun with the little spikies on his head behind him. So you kind of can see um, how emperors would um, kind of take on the image of Sol or take on the power of Sol to maintain their own station and their own reign. So, of course, Constantine is famous for being the first Christian emperor, or at least the one who allowed for Christianity to exist and then flourish. So it feels kind of strange that he would have this relationship with the god Sol. But he actually, the first vision of Constantine that we have record of was actually a vision that is claimed to not have come from the god of the Hebrews, the god of Jesus, but from the god Apollo, who of course is another god of the sun, in the year 310. And this vision told him that he would reign for 30 years and that he should take up this image of the sun as his right, and that he would have the powers of the sun to support him. But then later in battle, as we have the famous story goes, Constantine had a dream, and this time he was not confronted by Apollo. He was confronted by the god of the Hebrews, the god of Jesus, and he was told to make the heavenly sign of God on the shields of his soldiers and then engage in battle. And according to Lactantius, who wrote the story in a book of the time, Constantine did as he was commanded, and the description of this sign was the letter X turned sideways with the top of its head bent around. He marked Christ on their shields. Armed with this sign, the army took up its weapons. And so there is this really interesting, if you kind of take off uh, your faith hat and you put on your history hat, there's this really interesting connection of Jesus as the Son, S-U-N, not just S-O-N, which of course is not a pun that you can make outside of English necessarily. But it's Christ as the Son, which we still use in some places today. For example, we've got the O come Emmanuel, Son of Righteousness, things like that we refer to Jesus as the S-U-N. And so there is this joining of Jesus, the unconquerable Son of God, with this unconquerable sun god Sol in the imperial cult under Constantine. So some scholars claim that Constantine actually never was really a Christian. He just saw an opportunity to use Christianity as a tool for political propaganda because he saw that his predecessors who had fought against the rise of Christianity and tried to suppress it, it wasn't really working out because it was a religion that encouraged people of all stations and told them that they had value. And so instead of fighting against Christianity, he decided to usurp it and use it for his own gains, use it for political propaganda in his campaign to maintain power as the emperor of a vast and diverse um, Roman Empire at this point. It's huge and covers a lot of ground and a lot of different cultures. And when you have people who you want to have connected to each other who aren't connected in other ways, finding a religion that can speak to people of all stations, especially those who are poor and make up the majority of your people, makes a lot of sense. And so there's that possibility, that's kind of what was going on with Constantine, and whether or not he himself was actually a Christian, I think ultimately historically doesn't matter because his behavior allowed for the rise of Christianity. But this celebration of the birth of Sol, then being celebrated right after Saturnalia ended on the 25th of December, because that was the date of the winter solstice in the Roman calendar. Of course, we've shifted it just a little bit so that now it's the 21st, 20th, 21st. Before it was the 25th, and so the birth of the sun makes sense to have it be born, as we talked about earlier, on the day that the sun starts to actually reestablish itself as dominant over night and cold and all of that. And so there was the Saturnalia that ran from December 17th until the 23rd, and then there was the birthday of the invincible sun on December 25th. And so possibly there was something going on there with Constantine kind of replacing the image of Sol with the image of Christ, and the sun god Sol with the sun god Christ. An interesting, an interesting some interesting possibilities there. But we don't necessarily know for sure, and we'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between Saturnalia and Christmas in a minute, because there's some assumptions that I think we make that maybe are not necessarily true. But before we do that, any questions, comments on this particular celebration? Good. Okay. So, does Christmas come then directly from this celebration of Saturnalia? I have here a picture of a Roman open market, and it's got our traditional Christmas tree. I will tell you that this is not an image of something that actually would have happened. As I'm sure anyone who has visited this part of the world knows, wood is not particularly easy to come by, let alone an entire fir tree, and so unlikely. But this idea that that Christmas comes out of Saturnalia is certainly quite popular, to the point that I think when people say it, they just kind of assume that it's true because it's been said so many times. And the argument being that Christians assumed that more people would embrace Christianity, embrace Christmas, if it was seen as a replacement option for Saturnalia, which people really liked, that they wouldn't have to give up their holiday. They would just have to kind of re-understand what was going on there. But it's actually, if you look historically at the evidence, this idea, this theory, was never actually written down until the 12th century. So, we don't know. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily untrue, but that's a long time to go without, having much evidence for it. And it wasn't when it was written down in a manuscript by a Syrian bishop named Jacob Bar Salibi. And he wrote, "It was a custom of the pagans to celebrate on the same December 25th, the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and revelries, the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized I guess, solemnized on that day. So that is actually where this idea comes from. It's much later than than the actual time when that transition happened. So it's kind of hard to say. Um, in fact, there is some evidence, some early evidence, that it was in some ways the opposite. Like I said, it wasn't until 274 that the Emperor Aurelian kind of revitalized this idea of Sol and Sol Invictus and having this holiday on December 25th. And so it may be that Aurelian choosing to bring this, birthday of the sun, um, the cult of the sun back into vogue was actually a reaction to the Christians who were starting to celebrate the birth of their God on December 25th and not the opposite, which is what we typically assume. So interesting um, that that we kind of make one assumption, but it just as easily be the opposite. But there's definitely historically, some kind of connection between these two holidays. Um, our There is a Christian treatise from the late fourth century, so this is those 300s during. This is about 100 years after the Aurelian thing, but it says, our Lord, too, is born in the month of December, the 8th before the calends of January, that is December 25th. But the pagans call it the birthday of the invincible one. But who then is as invincible as our Lord, who defeated the death he suffered? Or if they say that this is the birthday of the sun, well, he himself is the son of justice. So an interesting hiccup in the assumptions that we make that they assigned Christmas to December 25th because of Saturnalia, because of this Sol Invictus. Well, it could potentially be the opposite, but there's something going on there that connects the two. And there's certainly lots of biblical evidence for Jesus being connected to the sun as well. Even in the book of the prophet Malachi, there is the Son of Righteousness, the Son of Justice, the true Son. That is names that become connected um, to Jesus in later interpretations of the Bible. So um, really interesting, possibilities and considerations there. But there's actually a second theory for why December 25th is the date that Jesus' birthday is celebrated. And it has nothing to do with Saturnalia, not even really much necessarily to do with the winter solstice. And that is because um, as um, as culture widened, as influences spread, the idea that a birthday, the day that you were born, is important in some way, actually comes from the Zoroastrians, from the Persians. And so there would have been really no interest in the date of Jesus' birth during his lifetime. Nobody really cared when you were born. It just wasn't something that people considered. And in fact, if you tried to bring it up, they probably would have, called you a pagan because only the Persians, cared about those types of things and where the planets were in the sky when you were born, and all of that kind of thing. But the church father Tertullian, he wanted to do some calculations and figure out, when all of these things happened in the calendar year. And so he determined that March 25th was the date that Jesus died based on his calculations of when the Passover would have taken place in the year that he decided, was the year that Jesus died. And March 25th is exactly 9 months before December 25th. And so because we like things to be nice and neat and packaged in, with bows on top, it makes a lot of sense that March 25th could be the day of the Annunciation, when Gabriel announced to Mary that she would conceive of the Holy Spirit and give birth to Jesus, the Messiah. And then 9 months later is December 25th, when he's actually born. And then 33 years later is when he died on March 25th also. And so from conception to death is exactly perfectly lined up on the same calendar date. And there's actually a lot of interesting evidence of this particular understanding of where this comes from. So here on the left, I have a piece of art that is depicting Mary listening to the angel Gabriel announcing to her the that she is going to conceive, and then up in the left hand corner we have, I don't know who this is supposed to be, God or another angel or something, is sending this little baby, this little naked baby, and he is holding a cross. And so that helps us not only to know that that's Jesus, but I mean, obviously it's supposed to be Jesus because there aren't any other babies involved. But the cross in particular is important because that is a reminder that Jesus is born for a very specific purpose, and it would take place on the exact same date as this announcement. So that's another interesting, possibility for why Jesus' birthday is celebrated on December 25th. Of course, we humans, as I said, like to make meaning. We like to find meaning everywhere. So I think that the truth is very complicated and a mishmash of both of these things and many other reasons why we ended up with December 25th as the day that we celebrate the birth of Jesus. Some scholars argue that there's no way that Jesus was born on December 25th because it would have been too cold, and if it was cold outside, then the shepherds would not have had the flocks out in the fields. Why would they be in the fields? They would be in warmer places so that they wouldn't be freezing overnight. But then others say that actually during that time of year they were preparing for certain sacrifices that needed to be done in the temple, and so the shepherds would have been moving the sheep to prepare them for that, and so it is possible that they would have been in the fields at that time. So all kinds of arguments, all kinds of discussions about this, and I don't think ultimately it really matters that much. Historically, what's historically true. I think that we humans, get much more value out of the meaning that we can pull out of it. And so the fact that we celebrate the birth of Jesus on what at least used to be the day of the winter solstice, I think makes a lot of sense. We're talking about themes of hope and renewal and restoration, and so all of those things, I think fit very, very neatly into that concept. So, comments, questions on that? Nope. All right. Moving along here. We're going to talk about a couple of Christmas or Christianity related holidays, and then we'll get into some other religions and other cultural phenomena from around the world. So there are lots and lots of church holidays that take place around Christmas. Many saints days that are connected to December and to the winter and to the winter solstice. But I thought St. Lucy's Day would be an interesting one to bring up, because even though St. Lucy's Day is observed on December 13th, December 13th actually at one point was the longest night of the year, was the winter solstice in Scandinavia, which is where St. Lucy's Day is most popular. So as you can see, calendars, didn't really match up very well at a certain points in history. But whatever, whatever the date was for that particular culture, they had something special that, gave meaning to that particular day. So St. Lucy's Day is on December 13th, and St. Lucy is historically understood to be a virgin martyr who lived in the early fourth century, so that those early 300s, in Syracuse. And she died under the persecutions by Diocletian, who preceded um, Constantine by just a few years. And so he was one of the emperors that I mentioned before, was trying to kind of get a handle on this Christianity thing and control his empire and control his people by getting rid of Christianity, and it just didn't work. And so then Constantine, perhaps, if you want to take the cynical view, decided that he was going to try the opposite and usurp Christianity for his own purposes. But Diocletian was not there yet. He wanted to get rid of them. And so the idea is that Lucy was um, a devout Christian. She took a vow of virginity. She did not want to get married, but then her mother wanted to marry her off to a pagan. And she went to the shrine of Saint Agatha to pray. In some versions, to pray for some way out of this marriage, and others to pray for um, help for her mother's chronic illness, because, of course, she would never pray for her own something for herself. She has to be pure and perfect. And so she's there praying for her mother, even though her mother is doing this horrible thing to her. And regardless, St. Agatha appears to her and um, told her that the illness would be cured through faith, or that the wedding would be canceled. And so Lucy was able to convince her mother to cancel the wedding, and then donated her dowry to the poor instead of using it to marry her off. But the man to whom she was supposed to be married was very angry, and he went to the governor to complain. And so she was threatened that they would take her to a brothel and drop her off if she did not renounce her Christian beliefs and marry this man. But they were unable to force her to move to get into the cart, or haul her off to the brothel. So the story goes that 1,000 men and 50 oxen are pulling on her, and they can't move her. She is stuck to the ground, and nobody can move her because God makes her so heavy that they can't move her. So instead, they stacked materials around her so that they could set her on fire. But as she, even as the fire was lit, she started speaking, um, talking about how her death would help to give motivation and comfort to other Christians, but it would only cause problems and pain for non-believers. A soldier tried to spear her in the throat to get her to stop talking, but that didn't work. They claimed that they gouged her eyes out to try to get her to shut up, and that didn't work. Her eyesight was miraculously restored. And finally, she died only after she was provided with Christian last rites, because, if you don't get last rites, then you can't go to heaven, as we all know. So, interesting story, a little gory, but St. Lucy, obviously is an important figure to some people, and especially in the Catholic tradition. Um, and then St. Lucy's Day, of course, we don't want to necessarily emphasize the part where she gets her eyes gouged out and gets burned to death. So instead, there is a different story related to her, where while she was a younger girl, she because she was so devout, she wanted to take care of people, and she would bring food and supplies to Christians who were hiding in the Roman catacombs. And in order to be able to carry as much food as possible, she put a wreath on her head and put candles in it and lit them so that she could see her way through the dark catacombs without having to hold a light to guide her through the catacombs to find the people. And so that's why we have the image with the girl with the wreath and the candles on her head, which whenever I see it just kind of makes me scared that some poor girl is gonna set her head on fire with these candles. Um, it's also helpful when we're thinking about the connections and the meaning making that in some languages, including Latin, Lucy or Lucia means light, and so her her feast day was held on the day that the light returned on the winter solstice. Um, now it's changed so that December 13th is not the winter solstice, and it's also not part of Christmas in particular, but it is part of Advent, and so it kind of is viewed by many today as a prelude, so to speak, to the arrival of the light of Christ on Christmas Day on December 25th. There's actually some interesting historical evidence for the understanding of St. Lucy's Day as being connected to the winter solstice. For example, there is a poem by the famous English poet John Donne called "A Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day being the shortest day." So something that is, clear and specific about that. So today, St. Lucy's Day is still celebrated in certain places, particularly in Scandinavia. There are some other places where it's celebrated too, like Italy. But in particularly Sweden is a very popular place for the celebration of St. Lucy's Day. And the girls, somebody is chosen to represent St. Lucy that year, and she's the one who gets to wear the wreath crown with the candles on it. Some places using real candles, other places using electric candles, so as to not set the hair of the girl wearing it on fire. Um, the There is also a tradition of making special buns or cookies called lucicat, and they're made with saffron to make them look yellow because they represent light, they represent the sun, and they are, you can see there maybe that they're kind of like backwards or even forwards, I guess, S shapes, and Lucicat actually translates directly as Lucy's cat, or light cat. And so there is a sense that um, Lucy's cat is there to help to usher in the light. Interesting that the cat is used because in Scandinavia, the devil traditionally was believed to take the form of a cat. Obviously, all dogs go to heaven, all cats are, from the devil or something. I can say that to the two of you because you're animal people. Um, but the saffron, creates the light and therefore kind of redeems the cat, so to speak, from that connection to the devil. And these light cats, are given to children to ward off the influence of the devil on the children, and then therefore on their families and their societies as well.
What in the painting, what is she holding?
So she is holding grain, and that is connected not necessarily to Sweden and Scandinavia so much as actually in Hungary and Croatia. St. Lucy's Day tradition there, people will plant wheat grains, and because it's on December 13th and there are 12 more days until Christmas, the wheat grains will germinate and will sprout, and you will have the little stalks of wheat coming out of the ground by Christmas Day, and those represent, the birth of Jesus and the new life that Jesus brings, in his coming. So kind of another tradition that is connected to Saint Lucy.
What are the eyes?
Oh, is that what that is? I know that with the buns, they would put raisins. Some people will put raisins on them to represent the eyes of the cat. So maybe something to do with that. I wonder if it's supposed to be that swirly thing. And it's
Yeah,
just,
oh, okay. Those are
yeah,
the ones I'm referring to. That just
yeah,
kind of looks unusual.
yeah. Maybe it's just, the pixels in the picture aren't great, and maybe it's that swirly thing in there. Maybe. I'm not sure. There's always tons of imagery in those icons, so I'm sure there's plenty to be found on St. Lucy out there. And I'm sure the tree in the background means something too. All right, we ready to move on? So because we're talking about the winter solstice, we have to also talk about a little bit more modern Christmas tradition, which is Blue Christmas or the longest night. Of course, this is something that we Lutherans do, Methodists, Catholics, Anglicans, Moravians, Reformed Christians will often do this as a way of acknowledging the anxiety and depression and sadness that often comes at this time of year, because of the weather, because of the coldness outside and the lack of connection with other people, because of the loss of loved ones and grief that is experienced during this time of year when you're supposed to have your loved ones with you and they're just not there. All of those different things that can be symbolized by that shortest day, longest night of the year. It feels like a longer night than usual, because of the literal long length of the night, but it also feels like a long night because of all of those experiences that are weighing down on you. Of course, I had to put Elvis up there for everyone's amusement and enjoyment to go along with Blue Christmas. Um,
That's especially for Karen.
yes. And me. I was a huge Elvis fan when I was a kid. So the worship services are, held on that longest night, December 21st. Um, and it's interesting because this day, is a newer recognition for Blue Christmas or for the longest night. But it does coincide with the feast day for Saint Thomas, the apostle, which is a much more long-term festival that's been celebrated on December 21st. And so again, when we're looking for different types of meaning, Thomas is the saint that is most well known for his struggle to believe in the resurrection, his struggle with faith. And so there is the opportunity to connect that struggle with grief and the struggle with maintaining our faith in the face of difficulty that can be made between the um, celebration of St. Thomas Day along with that longest night service. So of course there are lots of candles involved in those services as a symbol for light and hope and things like that. Um, I was interested to learn, I did not know this, but apparently Blue Christmas has also in recent years taken on another meaning, um, that because it's called Blue Christmas, the connection to the Back the Blue movement was made with this. And apparently, some communities are no longer using Blue Christmas as an opportunity to recognize the legitimacy of grief and loneliness at the time of Christmas, but to um, celebrate the dedication and work of police officers in their communities. I did not find any evidence related to exactly why they decided to do this when they did. But I myself made a little bit of a connection. The first time, according to the different sites that I read about this, they said that the first time that this Blue Christmas with police officers was done was in the year 2016. And it just occurred to me that that was an interesting time to decide to transition the meaning of Blue Christmas um, toward police officers, because while we understand that it's a challenging job to be in, and the holiday season certainly makes it harder with people doing a lot more driving, and it gets cold and dark and wet and snowy and icy, and so there's a lot more potentially to do. But 2016 was the year that kind of wrapped up several years worth of incredibly high profile police shootings of African American people. And so, names like Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, and Philando Castile are probably familiar to you, unfortunately, because of their lethal engagement with police officers during the last moments of their lives. And so it is a little bit concerning to me that that we would now have on the internet just a no, not um, non-thoughtful description of this as just another way that Blue Christmas can be interpreted without any kind of context and without any kind of consideration for why the timing of that might be a little bit challenging for some communities, and therefore should be for, I think, for all of us. So, any Blue Christmas comments, thoughts? All right. So let's move on to a few um, other cultures. And I'm going to try really hard to pronounce these things properly. Probably won't do very well. So this next one is called Nata e Buznit, and it is an Albanian tradition. It is from a pagan and extremely ancient celebration of the return of the sun on the winter solstice and the lengthening of the days. A scholar from the mid 1800s reported that as Christianity spread into Albania, and before his time, the missionaries that were moving through Albania worked really hard to fight off the pagan rituals that were practiced by the Albanians related to the winter solstice, but they were just unable to oust all of this from them. And so, as usual, some of this has kind of maintained its old meanings. Other things have been um, subsumed by Christianity and by Christian images and things like that. And so there's kind of an interesting interconnection of Christianity and pagan cult going on in here. So some of the things that happen during this festival that happens on the night of the winter solstice is they had fires. Big bonfires in order to give strength to the sun. The light from the fire could send light and strength to the sun. There was an understanding that sacrifice of animals or plants would help with the upcoming agricultural season as they looked forward to the end of winter and the beginning of the planting season. And so animal sacrifices could be made on the fire, or, for example, pine trees could be burnt, things like that. Divination was often practiced in relationship to the crackling of the flames in the fire. Um, there, of course, there's lots of eating and things like that. Um, Variety of magic kinds of actions related to um, the fire and the animals that are involved and the plants that are involved in the whole thing. Um, the Yule log is, of course, celebrated in a variety of places for a variety of reasons, and nobody really knows if they all stole from each other or just kind of developed along their own paths because of the presence of wood and the use of wood to create warmth and light. Um, but the boozme is a ritualistic piece of wood that is put to burn in the fire of the hearth on the night of the celebration after the winter solstice. So the night of um, usually nowadays Christmas Eve, they burn this boozme wood as a celebration of the return of the sun um, after after the 21st. So that is one interesting cultural celebration that happens related to the winter solstice. Any questions are on that one? Okay. Next one, as I promised, we'll talk about Yalda Night. So this is a celebration that happens with people in Iran or people of Iranian heritage. They celebrate, of course, Iran is in the northern hemisphere, and so this is still related to the same day of December 21st, the longest and darkest night of the year. And this is one of the oldest of the Iranian traditions that was present in Persian culture from ancient times. There is a sense that it is a night for welcoming, for spending time with family. Um, all the family is supposed to gather together in the house of the eldest of the family, and they eat and drink. They recite poetry together. There's a woman pictured there who is reading from a book of Persian poetry. And in particular, there are some special foods that are highlighted as important for participating and eating during this festival, including nuts, pomegranates, and watermelons. And the reason for that is because they are red, and red represents the light of the sun, the heat of the sun. And so they like to eat those things. Of course, here in Reading, watermelon. I mean, you can get watermelon now because they import it, but it's usually not very good because this is not watermelon season. But in other places around the world, you can get watermelon at this time of year, and so they eat watermelon and pomegranates on this night, and you read the poetry. Hoping for a bright sunrise and then the coming of the longer days um, after the winter solstice. Um, there is another name for this festival. It's called the Night of 40. And the reason for that is because it marks the first 40 days of winter, which are understood to be the coldest and worst days of the year for survival and for thriving. Um, and so the festival is celebrated um, for that um, that 40 days, but it begins on the winter solstice. So like us, the understanding is that the solstice itself is the first day of winter, and then the 40 days after are really tough. And so in order to survive it better, you celebrate. You get together with family and friends so that you can get through those tough nights with good company and be cheerful and celebrate the rebirth of the sun, that even though right now things are tough, the sun is coming and it's slowly every day, even though we don't necessarily notice it, it's coming back. And so it's a time to be happy and hopeful, even when it's a little bit um, challenging. Modern celebrations of Yaldan night. People get together, they go to the homes of their grandparents or elderly relatives, and they stay up all night, actually, a lot of times. They wait for the sun to rise so that they can welcome the renewed sun. Like I said, they read stories and poetry and recite verses. Often there's singing and of course, eating all of the yummy food and the colorful, especially particularly the red, but other colors as well. The coming of the dawn, the fire, of red, um, signifying life and fertility and renewal and all the things that we hope for during the cold of the winter. So there's another one. Questions on this one?
So there isn't any quote unquote religious significance to this holiday. Is it tied to anything related to faith?
So probably the closest, the most obvious religion that would be, widespread in Iran would be Islam. And so I'm sure that there are connections made with with the Muslim faith and this particular holiday, but because it is an ancient Persian and ancient Zoroastrian um, tradition, I think if anything else, it would be kind of how we do things with Christianity and kind of just pull it in and call it call it okay and pat it on the head and just let it happen. Um, so there doesn't seem to be any particular um, Muslim bent to it, unless perhaps individuals and individual communities have incorporated some particular things. Maybe the readings aren't from the ancient Zoroastrian poets, but would potentially be from the Quran or something like that. But it seems like it's a fairly cultural, secular cultural kind of phenomenon for the most part. All right, moving on. The Dongzhi Festival is happens in China. It is again a winter solstice festival, and it in China is connected to the philosophy of the yin and the yang, the balance of the cosmos. Is represented by this being the time when the darkness um, as represented by the yin is at its strongest, and so to make sure that we are keeping ourselves emotionally and spiritually safe, we we have these celebrations to help to kind of overcome the extreme of winter. Dongzhi, Dong is the Mandarin word for winter, and Zhi means either arrival or extreme. And so the arrival of winter, but also the extreme, of all the things that have to do with winter, the extreme cold, the extreme isolation, because you can't go outside, the extreme of weather, all the different things that come with that, along with the extreme of the night of the darkness. Um, it is just a 1 day celebration, so it doesn't happen for multiple days like some of the other festivals do. Um, but the hopefulness and the celebration that things are finally turning around, and that negative energy of the yin is finally um, decreasing, and the positive yang energy is growing as you get closer and closer to spring, and you get longer days. Scholars believe that this festival originated during the Han Dynasty, and the lunar calendar was really important because of the agriculture was essential for survival at that time, and so people were very tuned into the seasons and the knowledge that even though it's kind of the dead of winter, this is the moment that where we realize that warmth is coming, life conditions are becoming easier, things like that. So people on this day would celebrate with their families. They would take a break from their work. In ancient times, they would have ancestor worship rituals. Over time, the worship part kind of just got a little bit less widespread, but it was still, understood to be a time for honoring honoring your relatives, certainly, making offerings perhaps in the name of your deceased relatives, things like that. Um, there is an interesting um, kind of alternative name for the day, which means Festival of Extreme Length. And the reason for that is not because it is a long festival, because it's only one day, but it refers to the fact that the sun is so low in the sky that it makes the shadows much longer. And so it's the length of the shadows that it's representing and pointing to. And so during the Han Dynasty, this festival was actually at a level, comparable to the Chinese New Year, which, today is one of the biggest festivals that is celebrated in across Asia, really. Um, so as kind of ancestor worship faded away in most regions across China, there is still some connection to that in some places, particularly the more rural areas where people on this particular day will go and visit the grave sites of their ancestors, and they will, do a little bit of cleaning and sweeping, repairing of graves, things like that. Perhaps they will pray and burn incense and offer food, things like that that are kind of showing respect to their ancestors without the heavier, ancestor worship kind of elements to it. Um, Others, especially those in the city, don't aren't even into it to that degree, but there's still a lot of getting together with family. People are often off work that day, or at least get off early so that they can visit their families. Um, and it is traditional in some regions of China to light incense when the sun rises and let the incense stick burn all the way down as the sun rises, to kind of represent that hopefulness of the coming of the restoration of the sun. What else do I have here? Oh, I have to explain my pictures here. So there are two traditional foods that are associated with the winter solstice celebration, and one of them is dumplings. Um, that is depicted with the people who've got the chopsticks, and the family that's together there on the right. They're just your typical meat dumplings, made with lamb or other meat. And the reason for that is because there is a traditional story that there was a famous doctor during the Han Dynasty, and there was a really cold day when he was traveling outside, and he noticed that the poor people had um, had those oh, what are they called? The when you especially get them like on your fingers and toes when your fingers swell up and get really red. What are those called? It has like a weird name. Do either of you know?
It's not frostbite.
No, it's not frostbite because it does heal.
I
Um,
think it's chillblains.
yes, yes, yes. So it's when there is damage to the blood vessels in your skin, and he noticed that they had these on their ears because you can't it's harder to cover your ears in the cold than it is even your hands. And so he felt compassion for these people, and so he told all of his workers that were traveling with him to make dumplings to warm the people to help them to prevent the chilblains because um, they would help them to maintain their body temperature. And of course the dumplings also look like ears and so there's an interesting connection there, although I don't know that I want to be eating dumplings and thinking about how they look like ears myself personally. But it's popular to eat dumplings or dumpling soup to get rid of the cold during this period. But there's another really popular treat during this time called tong yen, and these are balls made with glutinous rice flour. And they can be made plain or they can have different types of fillings inside. Sometimes they're sweet fillings, sometimes they're savory fillings. But no matter what they have inside of them, they are served in warm broth or syrup. And nowadays, it's really popular to dye them different colors. And so you can see here, there's a picture of the bowl with the broth, and they've got white ones, but they've also got pink ones. And then there are some people out there who are showing off their platters of these. Oh, actually, I don't know if those might be dumplings because they're not circles. But either way, they're either dumplings or these little rice balls, and they're dyed in a variety of bright colors to celebrate the pink and green and yellow, the kind of colors that we I think typically associate with Easter are popular during this time for this celebration. And so people make those tasty treats and share them with each other, get together with family, things like that. Any questions on that one? All right, then last one. So all of these other celebrations are all in the Northern Hemisphere. So I felt like I really needed to find us one for the Southern Hemisphere because they have a winter solstice too, but it's not at the same time of year as ours. So I just wanted to make sure that we got that in there. So this is called Wei Tripantu, and this is a celebration that is recognized by the indigenous Mapuche people of Chile. So their shortest day and longest night is in June, not in December. But they have very similar experiences of the winter and the coming of the sun and the beginning of a new cycle of nature. In their communities, this is even a time when trees and plants begin to bud and birds start to become active and things like that, just because of how the seasons work in Chile. And so the understanding of this culture is that the new sun is born in winter and grows throughout the spring before it kind of peaks in the summer, and then it fades away again as the fall comes. And so the winter solstice is literally the rebirth of the sun for another year. So if people gather around a fire in the evening to tell stories, they've got music. There are a variety of traditional instruments like horns made out of bamboo, flutes made out of wood. You can see ceremonial drums there. And then this is part that I'm not really into, but one of the traditions is that at dawn, people will go to nearby bodies of water, rivers, and streams, and they will wash themselves in the freezing water of the stream. And the concept is that it is leaving behind the old energy of the old year and receiving new energy for the new year. And so a person that talked about participating in this said they do it at 6 in the morning when it's still half dark. So not only is it really cold, but it's also dark. There's also particular prayer services that are performed in the native language of the Mapuche people, and it's for thanking the earth for the good things from the past year and asking for transformation of any negative things. So there's no God in their culture, but they talk about and honor the energy of the earth itself, of the natural resources of the earth, and of all of nature in terms of people and animals and plants and things like that. Um, Obviously, lots of food. They've got all kinds of meaning in their food, particularly related to representing, because it's the end of one year and the beginning of a new cycle of the sun. It kind of represents all of the efforts of the people and the energy that the sun has given them in the past year that they eat together. And then there are games and dancing and all kinds of other fun things, competitions, things like that that happen depending on which community you're in. And then there's sometimes in a little bit larger communities, they've got parades and things like that. So that's what the masked person is from a parade that I found. So I thought that was an interesting one from a different part of the world. All right. So kind of wrapping things up. I think that, we see certainly the same themes across a lot of these, the light, the return of the sun and the hopefulness, um, the need for warmth in the cold periods, but also the promise of warmth that is coming as the sun returns, restoration, community, not just in term, I think all festivals I think involve community, to some degree. But I think particularly with winter solstice festivals, community is important for the recognition that, we can't survive without each other when we're talking about kind of the hardest part of the year in terms of survival and finding enough food and the harsh elements that are out there that are against us. We have to kind of band together and support each other. And so it's not just community that in terms of, oh, isn't this nice that we can get together and do this, but it's the vital importance of community for survival and thriving. And then, of course, rebirth and renewal. With Christianity, we've got the birth of Jesus and the hope of the renewal of our relationship with God. Other places that don't have, particular religious connections have still the rebirth of the sun or the rebirth of, the coming of spring, things like that. And I put in parentheses, I wondered about using the word victory in this time because it feels like a time when, everything is kind of dismal and dark and cold. But to be able to say, we survived this. We've made it to the time of that things are the most difficult, but we're surviving it, and not only surviving, we're thriving, we're celebrating, we're eating, we're drinking, we have time to make merry, even during this most challenging time. I think is a in a sense it's kind of a an act of rebellion against, whatever you understand to be the forces that are against you, whether that is, something spiritual or whether it's just, the nature of nature. we made it and we're still here and we're still going strong. There's kind of a sense of that, I think, in there too. Any other words or concepts or thoughts that you see throughout this?
It's hard to get unmuted sometimes. Um, no, it's just really interesting to me that, they all have like this basic stuff of getting together and celebrating. It is a victory, I guess. I think that's really interesting.
Got anything, Cindy? Same thing as ditto.
Yes, yes, like the house decorating with the next door neighbor saying ditto and pointing to the
Yes.
neighbor's house. I'm pointing
Yeah.
to Karen.
Yeah, I think it's of great value for us in a time when, we are being encouraged to differentiate ourselves from others and, have the kind of us versus them, for us to recognize just what we have in common with others. It might look different. We don't eat watermelon or pomegranates during this time of year for the most part. But the concept is the same, the impulse is the same, the human experience of, um, wanting hope in the face of challenging times, and um, looking forward to the return of sun and warmth, and times when it feels a little bit less precarious to survive day to day because you've got stuff growing outside your window rather than looking out at the barren land outside your window. I think all of those things really connect us together in a way that is fundamental and much more important than some of the things that are being highlighted as reasons for us to distrust each other and to reject each other. So I've
Hmm.
really been enjoying this whole process.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I have for this time. Oh, I forget what I put. I forget what we're doing next time. New Year's, I guess. Yeah, New Year's. We'll talk about New Year festivals next year, and some of these felt kind of New Year's-y with the understanding that the return of the sun. There's always going to be overlap with all of these, but I think it'll be fun to look at that, and especially fun to look at different cultures and when in the year they think is the new year. I think that'll be interesting to
Yeah.
experiment with some of that. So,
Sounds good.
all right. Well, thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
And I hope you take care of
Thank
yourselves.
you,
If I
Kate.
don't see you, have a Merry Christmas.
You too.
You too.
And I will see you all in the next month.
Next year.
Yes, and next year.
Right, right.
All right. Take care, everybody.